The night was not empty, though it appeared so from the edge of the road. It carried with it a heaviness, a kind of pressure that settled into the bones of anyone who lingered too long beneath its sky. On the cracked blacktop, the silence was not comforting but oppressive, as if the air itself were listening. Streetlights ended miles back, leaving only the headlights of a passing car to carve fragile shapes out of the darkness. In those beams, the trees stood like endless walls, their branches locked together in a canopy that seemed older than the highway itself. People often said that the forest along that stretch of road felt wrong, though wrong was a word too small for it. It was not the kind of wrong that came from danger you could see, but the kind that hid in plain sight waiting for a misstep. Every small town nearby had a version of the same story: travelers who made a wrong turn and vanished, families who were swallowed by roads that should have led home but did not, headlights spotted in the distance where no road existed. They were tales told in hushed voices, dismissed in daylight, and remembered again only when another car failed to arrive where it was expected. There was once a man who said that the scariest sound in the world was not the scream of someone being hurt, but the sound of a car engine cutting out in the middle of nowhere, when you were already lost. He had not known when he said those words that the forest would one day prove him right. The first of the disappearances did not cause panic. People assumed it was nothing more than an accident, the kind that happened every year on unlit country roads. A young couple leaving a gathering late one night, driving home in the blur of fatigue, called a friend to say they had missed their turn but would be there soon. Their voices were calm, almost casual. The call ended without alarm. Hours passed. They did not arrive. By morning, the search began. Their car was discovered at the edge of the woods, doors locked, keys still in the ignition, headlights off. There were no footprints leading away from the vehicle. It looked as though they had simply vanished while sitting in their seats. What unsettled the investigators most was not the emptiness of the car, but the road itself beneath it. When they tried to plot its coordinates, they realized that stretch did not appear on any map. The asphalt was real, laid with care decades earlier, yet official records showed nothing had ever been paved there. It would have been easy to write off as clerical error, a misplaced survey if not for what came next. A group of friends vanished on their way back from a festival 2 months later. They had texted one of their families, saying they had taken a back road the GPS had suggested and would arrive in an hour. Their last message ended mid-sentence. When investigators followed their digital trail, the final signal led them to the same patch of forest where the couple had been found. But this time there was no car at all, only tire marks in the dirt that ended abruptly as if the vehicle had driven forward and dissolved into thin air. Police dogs brought in to track the scent circled aimlessly, whined and refused to go further. One officer later admitted that he felt an almost physical resistance in the air when he tried to step past a certain line of trees, as though something was warning him not to. The towns nearby began to whisper again. They said the wrong turns were no longer accidents. They were traps. The stories grew, some too wild to believe, others too familiar to ignore. One man stumbled out of the forest weeks after his group had gone missing, barefoot and trembling, his eyes sunken with terror. He was the only one who ever returned. His account was fragmented, but the details he managed to share were enough to change everything. He spoke of roads that split and twisted in ways that did not exist on any map, of signs that pointed to towns he had never heard of, towns that vanished when he tried to follow. He claimed that at some point, the forest began whispering his name in voices that sounded like people he loved. He had run when the voices told him to stop, and he had kept running until he broke free of the trees. He could not explain how long he had been inside, or why the others had not escaped with him. All he could say through cracked lips and a shaking body was that the road had not wanted him. It had wanted the others. This was not the kind of story that stayed contained within a single community. News spread beyond the towns, and drivers from far away began to take notice. Some came out of fear, avoiding the region entirely, marking the highways with warnings on their maps. Others came out of curiosity, hoping to catch a glimpse of the cursed stretch of road for themselves. They often left disappointed, finding nothing but quiet forest and empty pavement. Yet sometimes, just often enough, a traveler would call a friend saying they had taken the wrong exit, or they would send a final photo of their car parked on a road lined with dark trees. And then silence. Their names joined the growing list. Families held vigils. Search parties combed the woods. The roads never gave back what they had taken, What remained was not only the fear of the disappearances, but the dread of how simple the mistake was. One wrong turn, one moment of trust in a road you thought you knew was all it took. There was no warning, no sudden violence, no final scream, just a turn of the wheel, the hum of tires against asphalt, and then the unknown. It was not death that haunted people the most. It was the absence, the unanswered questions, the lingering suspicion that the road was still there, patient, waiting for the next driver who would not notice the way the forest leaned a little too close, or the way the air grew heavy just before the turn. The road did not appear out of nowhere. Long before the first disappearance, that stretch of asphalt cut through land that people had already learned to avoid, generations earlier, when settlers first carved their homes into the wilderness. They marked that area of forest with silence rather than stories. No songs, no prayers, no gatherings happened there. Men who hunted in the woods traced wide circles around it, muttering that the air was too heavy, that animals would not cross into it, that firewood gathered from those trees burned too fast, leaving only a choking smoke. There were records of attempts to build a settlement close by, but each one failed within a season. Crops refused to grow. Livestock broke free from their pens, and families moved on without explanation, leaving their cabins to rot. Locals said the forest did not want to be cut, that it swallowed anything left within it. When the state finally laid pavement across the region decades later, it was out of necessity rather than desire. Officially, it was meant to connect small towns, providing a quicker path for commerce and travel. Unofficially, construction crews told each other that the ground fought back. Survey equipment failed, compass needles spun, and entire stretches of road had to be repoured after they cracked within weeks of completion. Yet the road opened, and for years it remained nothing more than an inconvenient detour, an empty stretch of highway where travelers rarely passed another car. The small communities nearby lived quiet lives, keeping their distance, whispering their caution only to those who asked too many questions. By the time the first family vanished, those whispers had already shaped the culture of the region. Grandparents told children never to take shortcuts through the forest roads, no matter what their maps or devices suggested. Truck drivers marked their own paths with chalk symbols hidden beneath their dashboards, rituals against getting lost. Farmers spoke of hearing engines on nights when no vehicles were present, faint hums drifting through the fields as if phantom cars were moving unseen. Hunters returned home with stories of seeing headlights far off between the trees, glowing where no roads existed. Each account was dismissed in daylight, but none were forgotten. The wrong turns became legends layered over lived history. Some said the land had once been a burial ground, not for individuals but for entire groups driven into the forest and left to vanish during times of conflict. Others insisted that the soil was poisoned, not by chemicals but by blood spilled in silence, deeds never recorded but never forgiven. Religious leaders in nearby towns called it cursed ground, claiming that roads should never have been cut through it. What troubled them most was the consistency of the unease. Every generation described the same sensations: the heaviness of the air, the absence of sound, the way the forest seemed to shift the further you stared into it. When outsiders laughed, locals responded with the same phrase: roads can be built anywhere, but not every road wants to be traveled. For those who grew up nearby, the forest was less a place than a presence. Children were warned never to wander into the trees, not because of wolves or predators, but because they might not find their way back. Stories of vanishing circulated long before the modern disappearances. Farmhands walking home after dark, riders whose horses returned without them, entire wagons found overturned with no trace of passengers. These stories were not filed in police records but carried in memory, traded like warnings between families who still lived on the edges of the forest. Even the mapping of the region had always been uncertain. Surveyors made sketches of routes that later vanished, paths marked on paper but never found again on return trips. Some suggested it was human error. Others admitted that the land seemed to change, as though the roads themselves were shifting beneath their feet. When automobiles replaced horses, people thought the wrong turn legends would die. They did not. If anything, they grew more frequent. Drivers spoke of signs pointing them toward towns that did not exist, of sudden detours suggested by their devices, of roads that narrowed until they disappeared into trees. Some laughed about it later, relieved when they found their way back. Others never spoke of it again. By the time technology promised precision, GPS, digital mapping, satellite guidance, the wrong turns became harder to dismiss. Devices gave instructions to follow routes that should not exist, guiding people into the same silent woods where others had vanished before. Police received calls from travelers saying they were lost, their screens showing a road that did not appear in any database. Moments later, the signal cut. Those calls never ended with the sound of panic. They ended as though someone had pressed mute. The community that lived closest to the forest carried the weight of all these stories. Their shops, their churches, their daily lives existed in the shadow of the missing. When an outsider asked for directions, the locals were deliberate in their answers. They said which roads to take and, more importantly, which ones never to follow. No one admitted outright that the forest could claim people. They simply behaved as though it could. The disappearances became part of the rhythm of their lives. Tragedies folded into an ongoing history of unease. People stopped asking why the road was built, why it remained open, or why the state never closed it after the accidents. They simply lived with it, marking time by the latest family that failed to return. To an outsider, it looked like superstition. But for those who carried the memory of generations, it was not myth. It was inheritance, a knowledge passed down not in stories for entertainment but in whispers meant to protect. It was why a mother held her child's hand tighter when they drove past the forest edge. Why fathers taught their sons the alternate routes home. Why elders refused to let the land be forgotten. They did not fear the road because of the deaths that had been recorded. They feared it because of the silence that surrounded everything the road had taken. And so when new disappearances began to draw attention beyond the towns, when reporters arrived asking for interviews, when outsiders demanded answers, the locals did not look surprised. They looked tired. They had always known that the road was not just pavement and paint. It was something older, something that had been waiting long before anyone built on it. The world had only just begun to notice. The vanishings did not come all at once. They crept forward slowly, a pattern that only revealed itself when the gaps between incidents grew shorter, until it was no longer possible to deny that something was unfolding along that stretch of road. The couple in the locked car was the first. Their disappearance explained away as an accident or perhaps a sudden decision to run from their lives, though no one who knew them believed that story. The group of friends was the second, laughter and music captured in their final voice messages, voices that faded as if the air itself had swallowed them. But what truly unsettled the region was what followed in the months after. Cases that came one after another, each with eerie similarities, each steeped in silence. A delivery truck, traced by its company, stopped transmitting only a mile from where the earlier vehicles had been found. Its cab was discovered days later, the doors wide open, cargo untouched, driver gone. A young woman driving home from college left her family a message saying she was nearly back, her voice calm, her words steady. She never arrived. Her car was found empty, headlights still glowing weakly until the battery died. Even more chilling was the phone, resting on the passenger seat, recording nothing but silence as if it had continued listening long after she was gone. The disappearances began to weave themselves into the rhythm of daily life. People who once passed the road without thought now spoke of it with unease, avoiding it entirely if they could, clutching their steering wheels tighter when detours forced them near its edge. Drivers who had no choice but to pass along its dark length described strange sensations, the feeling of being watched, of headlights appearing behind them only to fade when checked in the mirror, of the road stretching longer than it should, minutes becoming hours while the forest pressed closer. Some claimed their radios crackled with whispers that grew louder as they drove deeper, voices they could not quite make out but that seemed to shift into tones they recognized. Others swore they saw figures by the roadside, pale and indistinct, waving as though asking for help, but disappearing when approached. It was not only travelers who noticed. Police officers sent to patrol the area grew reluctant to return. Several admitted privately that their compasses spun uselessly, that their patrol cars stalled without cause, that they heard voices calling from the trees when no one else was near. One report, never released publicly but whispered among the ranks, described an officer who claimed to see the missing couple still sitting in their locked car, staring blankly ahead though the seats were empty when his partner looked inside. The partner said he found him trembling by the roadside afterward, insisting that the couple had been there, their faces pale, their eyes fixed forward as though frozen in place. The officer resigned a week later. For the families, the waiting became unbearable. They gathered in vigils by the edge of the woods, holding candles that flickered in the wind, calling the names of the missing into the trees. No answers came back, only the stillness of leaves brushing against one another. Some swore they heard responses, faint and distant, the voices of their loved ones calling back. Others dismissed it as the cruel trick of grief. Search parties combed the woods in wide sweeps, but their trails always circled back. Maps became confused, and teams found themselves emerging miles from where they had intended. Hunters who knew every ridge and stream in the forest admitted that certain paths twisted into places they had never seen before, while familiar landmarks vanished without warning. No one could explain how roads that had been charted on one day seemed to disappear the next. Then there was the lone survivor, the man who stumbled barefoot from the woods, his clothes torn, his skin streaked with dirt and blood. He was half-conscious when found, muttering about roads that split endlessly, about signs that changed when he tried to read them, about whispers in the air that told him to stop. His companions were never found. He could not say where they had gone, only that the road had chosen him to leave while it kept the others. His testimony was fragmented, contradictory, almost impossible to piece together. But there was something in his eyes that silenced doubt. They were not the eyes of someone inventing a tale. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, someone who had escaped something he could not name. What disturbed investigators most was the way the road itself seemed to resist being pinned down. Maps showed nothing unusual, yet GPS devices malfunctioned when nearing the area, screens flickering, routes recalculating endlessly. Some drivers reported being redirected to that stretch even when their destination lay miles away, as though their devices insisted that the forest was part of their journey. The wrong turn was no longer an error of human judgment. It was a command delivered by something unseen, a pull that guided wheels and footsteps into silence. As the disappearances mounted, theories swirled. Some said it was the work of predators, hiding in the woods and striking at travelers. But predators left signs: blood, broken glass, struggle. Here there was nothing but silence and intact vehicles, as though the people inside had been lifted gently out and carried away. Others whispered of sinkholes, sudden collapses in the earth that swallowed entire cars. Yet no evidence of collapse was ever found, and the cars that remained stood untouched, waiting on roads that should not exist. Each unanswered question deepened the dread. People stopped asking how the wrong turns happened. They began asking when the next one would. There was a sense, spreading through the towns like rot, that the road was no longer just a place but a presence, patient and deliberate. It did not strike at random. It waited, biding its time until someone was tired enough, distracted enough, desperate enough to trust the turn. And then it took them. When the wrong turns became too many to ignore, investigators descended on the region with notebooks, recording equipment, and the assumption that reason would prevail. They expected to find evidence of human interference, signs of criminal activity, a hidden encampment, or perhaps an environmental hazard overlooked for too long. Instead, they found nothing but contradictions, a trail of fragments that refused to form a complete picture. The first clue was the pattern of the cars themselves. Vehicles were often found intact, doors locked or slightly ajar, possessions still inside, headlights burning until the batteries drained. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no blood. In one case, a cup of coffee still sat in the cup holder, steam faintly clinging to the lid as if the driver had stepped out only moments before, yet no footsteps marked the soft ground outside. In another, a child's toy was found on the floor of a back seat, the straps of the car seat still buckled, but the child gone. Investigators took photographs, collected fingerprints, logged every detail. None of it explained how people could vanish so completely. Witness accounts only deepened the confusion. Locals described seeing headlights weaving between the trees where no road should have been, glowing faintly like distant lanterns in the night. A hunter swore he stumbled across a rusted car door half buried beneath moss, its paint stripped by years of decay, though no one else could locate it afterward. One searcher reported hearing the faint hum of an engine idling in the distance, though every team in the area had already powered down their vehicles. Another swore she saw figures in the forest line, standing perfectly still, their faces turned toward her, though no features could be made out. When she blinked, the trees were empty again. Testimonies conflicted not because they canceled each other out, but because each added another impossible piece. The survivor who emerged from the woods was studied closely, his words dissected by experts who wanted to dismiss them as trauma-induced hallucination. Yet his story carried details too sharp to ignore. He described signs pointing to towns he had never heard of, names that did not appear in any atlas, written in lettering that looked faintly wrong, as though borrowed from another language. He spoke of a moment when the road split into 3 directions, each identical, each stretching endlessly into blackness, the painted lines shimmering as if alive. He said the voices that called to him did not sound monstrous but familiar, repeating words only people close to him would have known. When asked how he escaped, his answer chilled those who listened. He said he ran toward the sound of his own voice echoing back from the darkness, though he never remembered speaking it. Scientific equipment brought into the region fared no better. GPS systems scrambled, showing drivers looping back in endless circles even when they drove straight lines. Compass needles spun slowly, refusing to settle. Radios picked up faint static that sometimes sharpened into fragments of speech. Words cut off as though someone were speaking from a broken frequency. Survey teams sent to map the area returned with sketches that contradicted one another. In one drawing, the road curved sharply to the east. In another, drawn on the same day by another team, it curved west. Some refused to sketch at all, admitting that the road seemed to shift when they stared at it too long. When investigators tried to document tire tracks left by missing vehicles, they found the marks cutting deep into soil, only to end suddenly in places where the ground remained unbroken ahead. It was as if the cars had lifted upward and vanished. Experts offered theories, but each faltered under scrutiny. Some spoke of sinkholes hidden beneath the forest floor, swallowing cars without trace. Yet geological studies showed no evidence of collapse. Others suggested criminal networks using the forest as a cover, abducting travelers for reasons unknown. But no tracks, no camps, no human evidence ever appeared. The most rational explanations could not account for the silence, the locked cars, the lack of struggle. That left the irrational, the theories that made even hardened investigators shift uneasily in their chairs. Some whispered about electromagnetic fields bending perception, creating illusions of roads that did not exist. Others wondered aloud if the forest itself was altering, expanding and contracting in ways the human eye could not register. The most unsettling idea came not from scientists, but from locals who had always lived with the stories. They said the road was not a road at all but a lure, something old and patient that wore the shape of pavement to draw people in. Artifacts occasionally surfaced, adding to the unease. A rusted license plate appeared nailed to a tree deep in the forest, its numbers belonging to a car that had vanished decades earlier. A fragment of glass etched with fingerprints turned up in soil far from where any vehicle had been found. Once, a searcher discovered a shoe resting in the center of the asphalt, perfectly clean as if it had been placed there deliberately, yet belonging to a missing man whose car had been found 20 miles away. Each artifact was logged, analyzed, and returned without answers. None carried the weight of proof. They were fragments of absence, reminders not of what was found but of what was not. The deeper the analysis went, the less it resolved. Witnesses contradicted each other, devices malfunctioned, evidence refused to align. Investigators began to describe the case in hushed tones, not because of what they discovered, but because of what they could not. Each clue seemed designed to pull them further away from certainty, each testimony a mirror held to another. It was as though the wrong turns were not accidents to be explained, but puzzles meant to consume anyone who tried. The closer they looked, the more the forest seemed to fold inward, swallowing the trail of evidence as easily as it swallowed the people who entered it. And so the reports piled higher, filled with maps that made no sense, logs of empty vehicles, testimonies that grew stranger with each passing month. No one could explain why the wrong turns kept happening, or why those who vanished never returned. All that remained was a growing silence, a mystery that thickened with every unanswered question, and a road that seemed to resist being known at all. What the road did not take directly, it ruined in silence. The disappearances were not just singular events, but ripples that spread outward through families, through neighborhoods, through entire communities until every life was marked by absence. Parents of the missing grew hollow in ways that no words could restore. Their homes transformed into shrines of waiting. Photos remained on walls. Places at the table were left untouched, and the phones were never switched off in case a call came from a number that no longer existed. Some families sat in their cars at night parked near the tree line, Headlights pointed into the forest, whispering the names of their children, as if the sound alone could guide them back. Others stopped speaking entirely, reduced to shadows of themselves, moving through their days with eyes that looked past the living. A mother was seen walking the edge of the forest night after night, her arms outstretched as though expecting her child to step into them. A father was found asleep in his truck at the same roadside turnout where his son's car had been discovered, refusing to leave the spot where the boy had last been. For these families, time ceased to move forward. They lived in a state of endless anticipation, a grief without finality because there were no bodies to bury, no funerals to close the wound. There was only the silence of what had been taken. Communities that once thrived on routine began to fracture. Stores closed earlier, roads emptied at dusk, and gatherings dwindled as fear spread from household to household. Neighbors who once trusted each other with spare keys and open doors now avoided eye contact, as though speaking of the disappearances might summon the same fate. Even schools felt it. Children whispering the wrong turn stories to one another at recess, inventing games where losers pretended to vanish into the trees. Teachers tried to stop it, but the silence hung heavier than any lesson. The younger ones grew up believing that the forest was alive, that roads could choose who lived and who disappeared. And in their eyes was a fear their parents could not erase. The lone survivor carried his trauma like a wound that never closed. He spoke little, often staring at walls as if expecting them to shift, flinching whenever he heard the low hum of passing traffic. In interviews, his voice would break when asked about the others, as though he still heard their names whispered in the dark. He became convinced that the road had marked him, that it had let him go not out of mercy but because it intended for him to live with the memory. He described dreams where he saw his companions sitting silently in cars that drifted endlessly along an invisible path, eyes blank, hands motionless on steering wheels. He woke gasping, convinced he could still smell the damp earth of the forest clinging to his skin. Doctors called it post-traumatic stress, but those who listened closely saw in him something deeper, a fear that had rooted itself in his bones. The psychological weight spread further still. Law enforcement officers who had patrolled the area began to resign or transfer, unable to reconcile their duty with the dread they carried. Some confessed to hearing their own names called during night patrols, voices that sounded like their wives, their children, echoing from the tree line. A few admitted that their marriages suffered, their minds consumed not by the missing themselves but by the possibility that one day it could be their family, their loved ones, their turn to vanish. Churches filled briefly in the aftermath of each disappearance, prayers rising for the lost, but even faith seemed fragile against the silence. Congregants spoke of feeling watched inside the pews as though the absence had followed them even there. The weight of uncertainty proved unbearable for many. A brother of one of the victims began walking the forest every day, convinced he would hear his sibling's voice if he only listened closely enough. He aged rapidly, his eyes sinking deeper into hollows, his steps slower each season. One night he did not return. His body was found, but not in the forest. He had collapsed in exhaustion on the roadside, his face turned toward the trees as if waiting for an answer that never came. Others withdrew entirely from life. Families moved away, leaving houses abandoned, their walls echoing with a silence heavier than emptiness. Those who remained lived in constant paranoia. They drove in tight loops to avoid the cursed stretch, even if it added hours to their journeys. They installed cameras along their porches and sat sleepless, watching for headlights that did not belong. The psychological scars were not only individual, but collective. The towns around the forest developed a culture of avoidance, refusing to mention the road aloud. Newcomers were given directions that deliberately rerouted them, as if speaking of the wrong turn directly would invite it closer. Maps were altered, signs removed, landmarks renamed in an effort to erase the presence of the cursed stretch. Yet none of it mattered. The fear was not in the physical place, but in the idea itself. The knowledge that a wrong choice, a single misplaced turn, could erase a person completely. That possibility lingered in every household, in every conversation cut short when the subject grew too heavy. The trauma did not need proof to sustain itself. It thrived in absence, in unanswered questions, in the silence that grew each time a new family failed to arrive home. Grief without closure became a form of madness, eroding trust, unraveling bonds, hollowing out entire communities until they lived not in the present, but in the shadow of what had been taken. And beneath it all was the quiet, unspoken belief that the road was not finished, that it was patient, that it would keep waiting until it found the next person too tired, too distracted, or too trusting to notice the turn that should not have been there. When the disappearances could no longer be dismissed as isolated tragedies, the full weight of investigation pressed down upon the region. Official task forces were formed, staffed by officers, search and rescue teams, and scientific specialists, each confident that reason would untangle the silence. They brought with them maps, ground-penetrating radar, drones, and all the tools modern investigation could offer. Yet each attempt seemed to fracture against the same wall of contradiction. Patrols reported compasses spinning until north lost meaning. Drones sent overhead lost signal in the same square mile where the vehicles had been found, their feeds dissolving into static before cutting out entirely. Radar returned images that made no sense, layers of soil folding against themselves, hollows where none should exist, empty caverns that seemed to shift when rescanned. The data was filed and reviewed, but the harder they looked, the less sense it made, as if the land itself was rearranging beneath their instruments. Theories grew, stacked one atop the other, none strong enough to hold the weight of certainty. The rational explanations came first. Geologists speculated about magnetic anomalies hidden deep beneath the forest floor, pockets of ore that scrambled instruments and disoriented drivers. Engineers suggested flaws in road construction, unseen weaknesses in the ground that might account for sudden sinkholes. Yet these theories crumbled under evidence. No collapses were ever recorded, and the cars that remained stood intact upon firm pavement. Biologists proposed a natural gas leak, a chemical seeping from the soil that could induce confusion, hallucination, and even sudden unconsciousness. But tests revealed no trace of gas in the air, no chemical signature in the soil. Each explanation carried a kernel of plausibility, but none stretched far enough to cover the locked cars, the vanished people, the silence. Psychologists entered next, proposing mass hysteria, the power of fear and suggestion to bend perception. They argued that the survivor who spoke of splitting roads in whispers had been broken by trauma, that his mind had invented patterns to make sense of chaos. They said the families who saw headlights in the woods were victims of suggestion, their grief reshaping shadows into evidence, and yet even they faltered when confronted with the consistency of accounts across decades. Generations had spoken of the same whispers, the same vanishing roads long before any investigator gave it shape. Mass hysteria could explain one case, perhaps two, but not centuries of repetition, not maps that contradicted themselves, not the steady escalation of vanishings. It was then that darker theories emerged, whispered first by locals, then reluctantly repeated by those charged with solving the mystery. Some spoke of the road as a living thing, an intelligence wearing the disguise of asphalt, feeding upon those who trusted it. They pointed to the patterns of disappearances, each separated by months, sometimes years, as if the road consumed only what it needed before retreating into silence. Others connected the forest to ancient violence, to unmarked graves beneath the soil. They said the land was never meant to hold roads, that the asphalt was a scar laid across a wound that had never healed, and that the vanishings were less a curse than a form of reclamation. In certain circles, the language grew even more supernatural. Investigators who would never risk such words in reports admitted privately to feeling watched, to hearing their own names whispered when the forest stood still. Some confessed to dreams where they found themselves driving roads that split into endless copies, headlights illuminating paths that stretched into blackness, each lined with figures standing silent by the tree line. These dreams left them shaken, reluctant to return. Conspiracies began to circulate among outsiders, amplified by those desperate for explanations. Some insisted the disappearances were not supernatural at all but deliberate, the result of secret experiments buried within the forest. They claimed the government had built hidden facilities beneath the soil, manipulating magnetic fields or testing weapons that warped perception. The locked cars, they said, were evidence of staged vanishings meant to cover larger truths. Others argued that the disappearances were linked to time, that the forest contained fractures, rips that pulled travelers into other decades or into places that never existed. They pointed to the survivors' account of strange town names on unfamiliar signs as proof. Skeptics dismissed it all as fiction, yet none could explain the raw data. The vehicles, the missing people, the silence that could not be erased. Official reports closed without resolution. Files were stacked in archives under the heading of unexplained. Pages filled with maps marked in red ink with logs of missing persons, with photographs of cars that looked as though they had simply been abandoned mid-journey. Each report ended with the same quiet failure, insufficient evidence to determine cause. But in the gaps of those documents lived something heavier than ignorance. It was the sense that the investigators themselves had become unwilling participants in the mystery, that their attempts to measure the forest had left them measured in return. Several transferred far from the case, admitting privately that the silence clung to them long after they left, that they no longer trusted the roads even in their new towns. Theories persisted, some rational, some terrifying, none complete. Perhaps the forest was marked by a natural force yet undiscovered. Perhaps the wrong turns were the consequence of violence buried too deep to be erased. Perhaps the asphalt itself had become a lure, a mouth that opened only when someone trusted it. Whatever the answer, it remained hidden, and the silence endured. Because in the end, every theory broke against the same reality. People had vanished, leaving behind only locked cars, unfinished calls, and headlights burning in the dark until the batteries died. No amount of reasoning could change that, and no theory could return the missing. The road was still there, unchanged, as though waiting. And each explanation, no matter how carefully built, collapsed under the weight of that single truth, that whatever haunted the wrong turns was not finished, and that the next driver might already be on their way toward it. The story of the wrong turns did not end with investigations or with the closing of files. It lingered in the lives of those who remained, pressing down with the weight of something unresolved, something still waiting. The road itself never changed. Asphalt cracked in places, faded lines peeled in the weather, and the forest pressed closer year after year. But it was still there, quiet, indifferent, as though nothing had ever happened upon it. Travelers still passed it, some without knowing, others with their hearts gripped by the memory of the missing. Families of the vanished carried their grief like a second skin, one that never loosened, never softened, only hardened into silence. Children grew up in houses where the names of uncles or siblings or parents hung like ghosts in the air, spoken in whispers, but never aloud. For them, the wrong turn was not a story told around campfires or in schoolyards. It was an inheritance, a reminder that at any moment, a life could be swallowed whole not by violence, not by fire, not even by accident, but by absence. And there was no defense against absence. What unsettled those who studied the vanishings was not just the tragedy itself, but the simplicity of it. A turn of the wheel, a blink too long at a dimly lit sign, a reliance on a device that whispered a new direction. These were the moments upon which entire lives had been lost. No warning sirens, no final screams, no evidence of struggle, just a decision so ordinary that it was invisible until it was too late. It forced people to consider how fragile their own choices were. Every road, every detour, every hesitation at a fork in the path could carry consequences unseen. Most led home, some did not, and that uncertainty began to bleed into every aspect of daily life. People no longer trusted themselves. Directions were second-guessed, roads questioned, maps checked twice, then checked again. Because once the story took hold, it did not remain bound to the forest. It spread into the mind, reminding each traveler that they too could make the wrong turn, and that perhaps it was not a mistake at all, but an invitation waiting to be accepted. What haunted the community most was the persistence of the road itself. If the disappearances had ended, people might have grown numb, convincing themselves that the land had been satisfied, that the hunger had quieted. But new reports still surfaced. Quiet mentions in local papers, sudden silences in households that once laughed, headlights glimpsed in the woods where no vehicle should have been. Even when no one vanished for years, the possibility remained. And that possibility became its own kind of curse, because how do you move on from something that has no ending, no conclusion, no closure? How do you live when the silence itself feels alive, waiting? Those who drove the road and returned often described the same sensation. Not terror, not even panic, but a hollow awareness that something was watching from the tree line. Some said the silence pressed against the windows, muting their voices as though the car had been sealed. Others swore they saw the road stretching longer, miles unfolding into hours without explanation. Many returned safely, shaken but unharmed. Yet every return raised the same question. Why them? Why had they come back when so many others had not? Survivors of simple drives began to carry guilt, whispering that perhaps they had been spared for now but marked for later. The fear grew not from what was known but from what could never be answered. The road became a mirror held up to human fragility. It showed how little control people truly had, how easily the ordinary could fracture into the inexplicable. It was not a monster that could be fought, nor a storm that could be braved, nor an enemy that could be defeated. It was a silence that consumed, an absence that left nothing behind. And perhaps that was why it terrified people most, because it stripped away the illusion of safety in everyday life. It was not a haunted house you could avoid, not a legend buried in the past. It was a road ordinary and unremarkable, waiting for someone to trust it again. Some investigators returned years later, not out of duty but out of obsession, convinced they had missed something, that one last search would reveal the truth. They brought with them new equipment, new theories, new determination. Yet each returned with the same haunted look, carrying more questions than answers. A few never returned at all. Their names were quietly added to the list, folded into the silence that had claimed so many others. In the end, even those who had sworn to expose the truth were swallowed by it. And the road endured. The story lingers not because it has been solved, but because it has not. It lingers in the minds of drivers glancing nervously at signposts, in the unease that rises when headlights cut too deeply into a forest road at night, in the awareness that not all wrong turns can be corrected. Some paths once taken do not lead back. They lead somewhere else, somewhere no map records, somewhere no voice returns from. And that knowledge is enough to turn even the most ordinary drive into a moment of dread. So the question remains, unanswered, unavoidable, echoing long after the engines have gone silent. What waits at the end of the wrong turn? And when it comes for you, will you know the moment it begins, or will it feel like any other drive home, right up until the silence closes in?